A restaurant staff refused to serve Dr. Henry, Black Doctor, because of how he looked. No one could have known what he was going to do when he went back to the same place the next day. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you are watching from today. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you like this story. Dr. Henry Collins slouched in his chair with his surgery cap still on top of his head. It was after midnight, according to the wall clock. For a moment, he closed his eyes and felt the stress of the day leave him. It had been a long, hard shift, with surgeries right after each other that put both his skills and his stamina to the test. Henry was sitting there and taking a deep breath when he thought about Mrs. Stella Moore, the famous lady he had just saved last week. It was close during the surgery, but she made it thanks to his steady hands and years of experience. He had a small smile on his face. Mr. Moore's fame or wealth didn't matter to him. What did matter was that she was living so her family wouldn't have to grieve her death tonight. That's why he became a doctor in the first place, to help everyone, no matter who they were or where they were from. A lot of people in Henry's neighborhood didn't think he could ever become a doctor when he was a kid. Those doubtful looks, whispered questions, and outright rejection were still fresh in his mind. But he kept going because he really wanted to make a difference. He saved the lives of everyone, from the poor man he helped last week to the most famous socialite in the city. Henry treated all of his patients with the same amount of care and devotion. Every life was valuable to him and deserved his best efforts. Henry felt very happy as he slowly took off his surgery gown. He was tired, his feet hurt, and his back hurt. But he knew he had made a difference today, because families would be whole and people would have second chances. That was enough to make it all worth it. He got his things together and was ready to go home to rest for a while before coming back to do it all over again. As Henry left the hospital, he said a small prayer of thanks for being able to help people, no matter who they were or where they came from. Dr. Henry Collins was not only a great surgeon, but also a truly amazing person because he was always fighting for fairness and kindness. Henry left the hospital after being in a clean place for hours. The cool night air felt great. He stopped for a moment to think about what he could do. Most of the time, he would go home right away, but tonight felt different. He did deserve a treat, right? With a small nod to himself, Henry chose to go to the fancy restaurant that his coworkers had told him so much about. They called it the Golden Spoon. It was meant to have food that would help you forget about your problems. Because he was so tired, Henry forgot to take off his coat, so he walked through the busy city streets again. Even though it was late, the streets were full of people. A lot of people looked at him funny, possibly wondering why a doctor wasn't saving lives and was out in public. As Henry walked, he couldn't help but feel a little out of place. The suits and dresses made his clothes stand out. But he stood tall and kept going. After all, he had earned this meal, right? He finally got to the Golden Spoon. The warm golden light from the diner filled the sidewalk and made him want to go inside. He took a deep breath and pushed the heavy glass door open. The restaurant was very fancy on the inside. There were crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. That gave the white tables and shiny silverware a soft glow. The soft clink of glasses and the low murmur of talk filled the room. As Henry walked up to the host's stand, he became acutely aware of how worn out and wrinkled his clothes looked. The host, a young guy in a clean black suit, was shocked and looked up at him. The host said, "Good evening, sir," and while his voice was polite, his eyes were asking, "Do you have a reservation?" James shook his head. "No, I'm afraid not. I just got off work and thought I'd treat myself to a nice dinner. Do you have any tables available?" The host looked around the restaurant quickly and then back to Henry's clothes. He looked like he didn't know what to do. As soon as Henry walked into the restaurant, he could tell that the mood had changed. From outside, the warm, welcoming glow seemed to fade, leaving behind an uncomfortable tension. The staff was looking at him suspiciously, moving their eyes. back and forth between his face and his wrinkled scrubs. The host's polite smile broke and was replaced by a look of barely hidden disgust. His eyes went over Henry's clothes one more time before he spoke. The host spoke with a tone of superiority. "I'm very sorry, sir, but we are fully booked for the evening." It was clear that Henry was sad, but he didn't show it on his face. He had to deal with a lot worse in his life and work. He took a deep breath and smiled instead. "I understand," Henry said, in a calm voice. "I know it's last minute, but is there any chance you might have a small table available, even just for a quick meal?" The host made a thin line with her lips. Henry could see a few empty tables from where he was standing as he looked around the restaurant. "A straw, I'm afraid not," the host replied. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the casual establishments down the street." It hurt like before in Henry's chest. He had been treated this way before, and it never got better. He wouldn't let anger or hatred grow, though. What really mattered to him were the lives he had saved that day, and the families he had comforted. "I see," Henry said, in a low voice. He stopped for a moment to carefully think about what to say next. He wanted to teach, not turn people off. "You know, I've just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital, saved a few lives today. I thought I'd treat myself to a nice meal, but I suppose my appearance doesn't quite fit your standards, does it?" A tall man in a clean suit walked up to Henry as he stood there, feeling the weight of the host's judgment. People close heard the sound of his shiny shoes hitting the marble floor, which caught their attention. The man asked in a calm but firm voice, "Is there a problem here?" The host stood up straight. "Mr. Jack, this, gentleman was just leaving. I've informed him we're fully booked." Mr. Jack, who looked like the boss, quickly looked over Henry. His eyes kept going back to the scrunched-up clothes and dirty shoes, and he made a frown on his face. Mr. Jack said, "I see," but he toned it down. "I'm sorry, sir, but as my colleague explained, we simply don't have any tables available at the moment." Henry looked around the restaurant and saw that a few of the tables were empty. His anger and sadness were building up inside him, but he kept his voice calm. Henry pointed to the empty tables and said, "With all due respect, I can see at least 3 empty tables from where I'm standing." Mr. Jack's face became more serious. "Those tables are reserved for our regular customers. We're way too busy tonight to serve walk-ins, especially ones who aren't dressed right," the manager said, and it was clear what he meant. Henry could feel his cheeks getting hot, but he wouldn't let shame take over. He had helped too many people and worked too hard to be put down. "I understand your concern about attire," Henry said quietly, "but I've just finished a long shift at the hospital. I was hoping to enjoy a nice meal after a day of saving lives." Mr. Jack raised an eyebrow a little, but he kept his attitude firm. "That's admirable work, but our policy is clear. We have standards to maintain." As word of their conversation spread through the restaurant, other people started to pay attention. "Shush!" Whispers and interested looks filled the air. Some people looked nervous, while others looked angry at Henry's expense. At a table close, an older couple looked at each other with worry. The woman leaned in close to her husband and whispered something that made him nod his head. More and more people turned to watch what was happening, making the stress in the air stronger. Henry could feel the weight of their looks. Some were kind, some were critical. He stood tall and was determined to handle things with grace, even though it hurt his heart that things were so wrong. Henry took a deep breath, and his chest felt tight. He looked at Mr. Jack and the host. The host's faces showed that they didn't like what he was saying. Henry said in a soft voice, "I get it." He left the diner with class, saying, "Thank you for your time." As he walked out onto the path, the cool evening air hit his face. His shoulders sagged a little as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. Henry could hear people talking inside the restaurant as he walked away. So he didn't look back, he just kept putting one foot in front of the other, while envisioning the scene over and over again. He felt more and more upset as he walked farther away from the restaurant. He felt sad and then disappointed, which was something he knew well. It wasn't the first time someone had treated him badly, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He sat down on a bench in a nearby park that was quiet. He looked up at the stars and felt a little better because of how beautiful they were. Though his voice was hard to hear, he asked himself, why does this still happen? As Henry sat there, his mind kept going back to his patients. He remembers Mrs. Moore's happy smile after her surgery went well. He thought about all the people whose lives he had changed, no matter who they were or where they came from. Within him, a strong will began to grow. Henry knew he could do something else. He could allow this event to break his spirit, or he could use it to push for good change. I can't change their minds, Henry told himself. But I can keep being the best doctor and person I can be. He got up from the bench with a new bounce in his step. Henry decided that he would do something useful with his anger. Perhaps he could begin a mentoring program for needy teens and young adults who want to become doctors. Or he could work on hospital diversity projects. Henry felt a lot of different things as he walked home. Even though inequality still hurt, there was a spark of hope in the air. Every act of kindness and every life saved was a step toward making the world a better place. Henry got to his simple flat by climbing the stairs with heavy steps. Once he got inside, he hung up his coat, sat down in his favorite chair, and let out a long sigh. In his thoughts, the events of the night were very heavy. Henry's mind went back to his time as a doctor as he sat in the quiet of his living room. He remembered all the late nights he had spent learning, the long hours of residency, and the constant pressure to do well. One moment stood out. It was his first day as an intern in surgery. When Henry walked into the hospital, he was full of energy and drive. But as he got closer to the nurse's station, he heard something that broke his heart. Do you really think he should be here? One nurse told another in a whisper. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and smiled at them as he spoke. I thought we were getting a new surgical intern today, she said. He said, good morning. My name is Dr. Henry Collins, and I'm the new surgical intern. He could see the shock on their faces. It was a look he'd seen a lot over the years. Another one came back, this time from his internship. During a complicated surgery, Henry was helping out when the lead surgeon suddenly passed out. Without thinking, Henry stepped in and did the process perfectly. But afterward, he heard people expressing surprise that someone like him could handle such a tough operation. Henry's eyes got teary as he thought about those times. Each one was a fight and a chance for him to show that he was valuable as a person and not just as a doctor. She deserved respect and fair treatment. As painful as some memories were, they made him happy, like the grateful smiles on the faces of patients he'd helped, the lives he'd saved, and the families he'd calmed. These were the times when all the hard work was worth it. Henry didn't feel depressed as the night went on. Instead, he felt energized. Each problem he solved made him stronger and more motivated to make the world a better place. Henry went to the hospital the next morning with a new sense of mission. He could smell the clean smell of cleaning as he walked through the familiar hallways. His mood was lifted by the knowledge that his skills and hard work were what counted most right now, where they were being seen. Henry's first surgery of the day was on a young boy who was born with a heart abnormality. As he walked into the operating room, he briefly thought about what happened in the restaurant. But as soon as he got there, all other ideas left his mind. As he worked to give this child a chance at a full life, his attention was drawn to the tiny heart in front of him. His hands were steady and sure. After hours, Henry came out of the operating room, tired but happy. The surgery had gone well, and he could already picture how happy the parents would be when he told them. Henry went around after a short break. In order to see how his famous patient was doing, he went to Mrs. Stella's room and said goodbye. She was now ready to leave the hospital and had been released. When he walked in, she was sitting up in bed, and her face lit up when she saw him. Dr. Collins, she yelled, her voice full of thanks. "I was hoping you'd stop by today," Henry said, as he walked up to her bedside and checked her vital signs. "Do you feel okay today, Mrs. Stella?" "Thank you so much. I feel much better," she said, her eyes shining. "Thank you for everything you've done. You've made my life better again." When she spoke, Henry felt a warmth go through his chest. He chose to become a doctor so that he could help people, no matter who they were or where they came from. He said in a soft voice, "I'm just glad I could help. Your recovery is going well. Just come back for a follow-up checkup." While they talked, Henry forgot about the bad thing that happened the night before. He thought about the difference he could make and the lives he could touch right now. That was all the proof he needed. Mrs. Stella was getting ready to leave the hospital when she heard two nurses talking in the hallway. They talked about Dr. Collins and how yesterday he was turned away from a fancy diner. "Is it real?" one nurse said in a whisper. "They wouldn't even give him a table, and he was still wearing his scrubs from saving lives all day," Mrs. Stella said. What she was hearing shocked her. She was so mean to Dr. Collins, the man who had given her a second chance at life. It was impossible. Mrs. Stella's mind was racing as she signed the forms to get out of jail. She had to do something because this doctor was so kind and didn't care about herself. She thought about how Dr. Collins had treated her so nicely and with respect, even though she wasn't important. It was time to say thank you. Mrs. Stella started to think of a plan on the way home. She had a lot of friends in the city and a lot of power, but she didn't use it for personal things very often. She chose that this was worth it though. Her voice rose, "Driver, please take me to the Golden Spoon instead of home." When she got to the restaurant, Mrs. Stella went right to the desk of the concierge. She knew the boss well and asked for a meeting right away. She became more determined as she waited in the fancy restaurant. Mrs. Stella told the boss what was going on when he or she arrived. She talked very strongly about how skilled and kind Dr. Collins was, and how he had been treated badly at the restaurant. The boss paid close attention, and with each word, his face showed more worry. Mrs. Stella told the manager, "I want to host an event here at the Golden Spoon to honor the city's unsung heroes." The manager excitedly agreed. "Of course, Mrs. Moore, it would be an honor to host such a party." When they started to talk about the specifics, Mrs. Stella felt happy. There would be more to this than just an event. It would be a way to celebrate those who have worked hard to make the world a better place. Mrs. Stella leaned forward and talked to the restaurant manager about the last few details. Her eyes were bright with purpose. She spoke in a firm but kind voice. "I want the whole venue for tonight. It's a private event, you get it?" "Yes," the manager excitedly replied, clearly excited about the chance to meet one of their most popular customers. "Of course, Mrs. Moore, we'd be happy to help you out at such short notice." As Mrs. Stella listed her needs, the staff was busy and excited, which could be felt. Everyone was excited, but they didn't know what the real reason for the sudden event was. Mrs. Stella pointed to the edge of the table and said, "We'll need the best china. And please make sure there are a lot of different things on the menu." There would be guests with the range of food preferences and needs. The manager was taking quick notes and listening carefully to everything she said. "Of course, Mrs. Moore. Even the pickiest eaters will be impressed by what our cook comes up with." The restaurant got more and more excited as word got around. The waiters hung up their shirts and the kitchen workers started getting the best ingredients. The sommelier chose wines from the best vintages with great care, because he wanted to impress Mrs. Stella and her unknown friends. With a small smile, Mrs. Stella watched the chaotic scene. She thought of Dr. Collins and how well he was taken care of here yesterday. She felt so happy because she knew that things would get better very soon. "Mrs. Moore, do you need anything else?" "What's that?" the manager asked, putting his pen on top of his notes. After a short pause, Mrs. Stella gave a nod. "Yes, there's one more thing. I want you to set up a special table in the middle of the table." The manager raised an eyebrow, but quickly calmed down. That should be the best table in the house. Of course, Mrs. Moore. We'll make sure it's great. While the staff continued to get things ready, Mrs. Stella sat back and felt a mix of excitement and satisfaction. She thought, tonight would be a night to remember. A night that would teach a valuable lesson about kindness, respect, and the true measure of a person's worth. Just as the sun was going down in the afternoon, Henry's phone rang with an unexpected message. It was from Mrs. Stella Moore, the upper-class woman whose life he had saved a few days before. A frown crossed his face as he read the invitation to a dinner that night in his honor. Henry blinks and reads the message again, a dinner for him. He was both confused and interested at the same time. He didn't feel like going to a fancy dinner after what happened at the restaurant the night before. But Mrs. Stella's words were kind and strong. Dr. Collins, the message said, your kindness and skill have changed so many lives. Tonight at 7:00 p.m., please let us show our thanks. At the Golden Spoon. The food place that had turned Henry down made his heart skip a beat. He wasn't sure what to do, and his thumb was on the return button. He wanted to say no, to escape any possible discomfort, but there was another part of him that she always tried to see the best in people, and told him to accept them as they were. Henry took a big breath and typed his answer. Dear Mrs. Stella, thank you. It would be an honor to go. As the hours went by, Henry became both worried and interested. Taking off his clothes, he put on his best suit, which was simple but classy. As he looked at himself in the mirror and fixed his tie, he couldn't help but think about what the evening would bring. Henry had no idea that Mrs. Stella was planning something much bigger than a simple dinner across town. The whole day, she talked to other patients whose lives Henry had saved over the years. As she talked about her plan, each call was full of joy and thanks. She told everyone, we're going to honor Dr. Collins and the difference he's made in our community. Everyone would love to see you, she said. One by one, they agreed, eager to show their gratitude to the doctor who had saved their lives. As each proof came in, Mrs. Stella's heart grew bigger. She believed that Dr. Collins would remember tonight for a long time. As the sun went down, the Golden Spoon was busy as never before. The waiters were busy moving around and polishing dishes and adjusting tablecloths. The chef yelled directions in the kitchen because he was determined to make the best food for the important guest that night. The restaurant's boss, Mr. Jack, paced quickly and looked from one corner to another. He muttered as he straightened a picture on the wall that was a little off-center. Everything must be perfect. Mrs. We can't make any mistakes tonight because Stella Moore is our most important patron. As the host, Beth, put fresh flowers at the door, she nodded to show that she agreed. She whispered, I heard she's bringing someone very important. It could be a famous person or a leader. Mr. Jack was very proud of himself. No matter who it is, they'll get the best service the Golden Spoon has to offer. As the staff rushed around, they said, we don't turn away important people here. They didn't know how ironic their words were, because the guest of honor was the man they had turned away the day before. Marco, the head cook, did a happy dance in the kitchen as he tasted his famous soup. As he poured the hot liquid into fancy bowls, he said, this will knock their socks off. Outside, valets stood at attention, ready to park the expensive cars that were about to come. It was the maitre d's turn to smile, eager to meet Mrs. Stella and her strange guest. It was clear that everyone was excited as the clock got closer to 7:00 p.m. The team got together for one last motivational speech from Mr. Thompson. Remember, he said, in a stern but excited voice, tonight could make or break our reputation. This town's queen, Mrs. Stella Moore, is a customer. And whoever she's bringing with her must be just as important. You should all be good, thank you. Each guest should feel like they are the most important person in the world. Is that clear? A group of people saying, yes, sir, echoed through the restaurant. As the staff went to their different jobs, They had no idea what a lesson in humility and kindness they were about to learn. They were about to welcome Dr. Henry Collins back as the guest of honor. This time, he would be with the people whose lives he had saved and touched. Dr. Henry Collins walked up to the golden spoon as the clock hit 7. He usually wears a simple button-down shirt and khakis when he's not in clothes. He took a deep breath, pushed the heavy wooden door open, and went inside. Beth, the host, looked up with a big smile that quickly went away when she saw Henry. She looked at Mr. Jack, the manager, with wide eyes, and waved wildly. Beth stuttered, "Sir, I'm sorry, but I think there was a mistake." She blocked Henry's way. "We're closed tonight because of a private event." Henry scowled with his forehead. "Mrs. Stella Moore invited me here," he said calmly, even though his chest hurt like it always did. Mr. Jack rushed over, and his face showed that he didn't like what he saw. "What the heck is wrong with this picture? Why?" he asked, avoiding Henry and talking to Beth instead. "This man says Mrs. Moore invited him," Beth whispered, her cheeks turning red with shame. When Mr. Jack turned to look at Henry, he smiled tightly. "Sir, I think this is something we've done before. This is a very exclusive place, and tonight, we're having a very important event." "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Henry said. He was upset, angry, and disappointed, but he had learned to stay calm. Over the years of being treated badly in this way. "I understand your worry," he said softly, "but I promise I was invited. Could we ask Mrs. Moore?" The manager's face turned red. He leaned in close and hissed, "Now listen here. I have no idea what game you're playing, but Mrs. Moore would never hang out with someone like." "Like who?" A sharp voice cut through the stress in the air. When Mrs. Stella Moore walked into the room, Mr. Jack's mouth was open, and he couldn't say anything. She moved purposefully with her eyes on Dr. Henry Collins as her beautiful navy dress swished around her legs. "Doctor, I love you, Henry." "Oh, my God," she yelled, holding out her arms. "I'm so happy you could make it." The staff was stunned and kept quiet as Mrs. Stella hugged and kissed Henry on both cheeks. Mr. Jack's face lost all color, and Beth looked like she was going to pass out. There was still Henry's arm around Mrs. Stella's waist when she turned to face the confused staff. "What's going on here? What do you want?" she asked in a sharp but steady voice. "Why isn't our special guest being properly welcomed?" "Guest of honor, Mrs. Moore?" Mr. Jack started to speak slowly. "Someone must be getting it wrong." "There is no misunderstanding," Mrs. Stella said clearly, her voice resonating through the whole room. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Please meet Dr. Henry Collins. This whole event is in his honor," someone said, and there was a shocked mutter in the crowd. Mrs. Stella went on, her eyes filled with tears. "Dr. Collins performed surgery on me last week and saved my life. But that's not all. He saved a lot of lives and treated everyone the same, no matter who they were or where they came from." She gently squeezed Henry's arm. "This dinner is my way of thanking him for always wanting to help others, not just for saving my life." Dr. Henry stood still, his eyes wet with tears that he hadn't shed yet. The restaurant staff shifted uncomfortably as the weight of what they had done earlier hit them hard. Mrs. Stella looked over at Mr. Jack and Beth, and it was clear that she was upset. "I hope this teaches us all a lesson. There's no reason to judge someone by how they look or guess what they're worth." The restaurant staff looked at Mrs. Stella with shock and guilt as she gently led Henry to the head of the table. As the truth of what they had done hit them, the shame on their faces burned. The boss, Mr. Jack, couldn't look Henry in the eyes because he was looking at the shiny floor. She had been so quick to judge and eager to turn away a man who had saved so many lives. Beth, the hostess, had tears in her eyes. Her heart was heavy with the weight of her mistake. When Mrs. Stella spoke to the people who were there, her voice was loud and clear. "Please take your seats, friends, family, and distinguished guests. Tonight, we honor a true hero among us." The guests, A mix of grateful patients and members of the community sat down and looked at Henry with eyes that showed both interest and respect. With a heavy voice, Mrs. Stella put her hand on Henry's shoulder. "Last week, I was on an operating table, and my life was on the line. Things were very bad, and it looked like there was no hope. But then Dr. Henry Collins stepped in." She stopped, her eyes shining with tears that she hadn't wiped away. Dr. Collins did a miracle with steady hands and unwavering focus. He not only saved my life, but also a second chance. Henry sat quietly. He was very humble, which was very different from how much praise was being given to him. He looked around the room and saw the faces of people who had helped him, people who had laughed at him in the past, and people who now respected him. "But wait, that's not all," Mrs. Stella said, raising her voice. "Dear Collins has made a big difference in a lot of people's lives in our area. That he cares for and loves everyone the same, no matter how rich, poor, popular, or unknown they are." As she spoke, the staff realized how wrong they had been. Because of their own biases and expectations, they turned away a man who was the best example of a good person. The room went silent when Mrs. Stella was done talking. A middle-aged man with a cane slowly stood up. He began to speak, but his voice was shaking. "Dr." he said, with tears in his eyes, "Collins saved my leg after a terrible accident. The other doctors were ready to cut off the limb, but Dr. Collins wouldn't give up. He worked hard, and now I can walk again," the man said. His words were emotional and hung in the air. They listened with faces that showed a mix of shock and shame. Next, Rose, a young mother holding a baby, stood up. "It was Dr. Collins who made this baby possible," she said in a soft voice. "He did surgery right away when I went into early labor. He saved both of our lives," she said. The baby cooed as if to say thank you too. Next to her was an old woman whose silver hair was neatly pinned back. "Dr." she said with a shaking voice, "Collins didn't just heal my body. When I was scared, he took the time to listen and make me feel better. He has the power to heal both bodies and hearts." One by one, more patients spoke up. There was a young boy who could play soccer again after a difficult knee surgery. A cancer survivor who beat the chances with Dr. Collins's skill and dedication. And a firefighter who went back to work after an injury that could have killed him. As the stories went on, the room became more and more emotional. The patients and the staff at the restaurant were both moved to tears. The boss, Mr. Jack, felt very bad about what he did. He turned this man away because of how he looked, even though he had changed so many lives. The weight of his mistake was too much to bear. The staff listened in stunned silence as the tributes went on, sharing looks of shock and regret. These people saw the man they had so rudely turned down as a hero and a source of hope when things were at their worst. Everyone looked at Dr. Henry Collins when the last patient was done telling their story. He sat at the head of the table with tears still in his eyes. When he didn't speak, the room went quiet. Henry stood up slowly, his back straight and his attitude humble. He cleared his throat and spoke to the room in a soft but clear voice. "I don't know what to say," he started, but his speech was a little shaky. "Mrs. Thank you, Stella and everyone else. Your words mean more to me than I can say." He stopped and took a deep breath to calm down. The people who worked at the restaurant looked at them with faces that showed a mix of amazement and rising unease. "But please don't think of me as anything special," Henry said next. "I'm just doing my job, which is saving lives and helping people, which I love and feel lucky to do every day. It's not something I do to get praise or attention. It's my job as a doctor and a person." Mrs. Stella wiped her eyes with a napkin and nodded to show that she agreed. The other guests listened carefully, with eyes filled with awe. "If you look at the patients around the table," Henry told them, "you are all real heroes. In spite of being sick and hurt, your strength and courage motivate me to do my best every day. The restaurant staff moved around awkwardly as Henry spoke. The boss, Mr. Jack, felt hot flushes run down his face. He looked at the hostess, Beth, and saw that her eyes showed the same sorrow he did. With a louder voice, Henry said, "I never expect anything in return for my work. The chance to help someone and make a difference in their life, that's all the reward I need," he said. His words were sincere and humble. It was clear that Henry's character was very different from how he had been treated in this place just a few days before. The staff members looked at each other, and you could feel their discomfort. They had been so harsh and rude to this man in their judgments. And now, they were seeing for themselves how kind and dedicated he was. As the night went on, the restaurant had a mix of happy and uncomfortable people. People kept telling stories, and each one showed how kind and skilled Dr. Henry Collins was in a more vivid way. People at the table laughed and cried freely, making the mood warm and personal. At the same time, the restaurant staff walked around the room refilling glasses and serving food. Their moves were stiff, and their smiles were forced. Every time they got close to the table, they heard bits of talk that made them feel even worse about their shame. Mr. Jack stood by the kitchen door with a sad look on his face. He watched as Henry laughed with Mrs. Stella and took note of the doctor's friendly demeanor and true smile, the same smile that he had brushed off yesterday as not fitting in his business. Beth almost dropped a tray of glasses when she heard a friend talk about how Henry had stayed by their bedside all night while they were having a hard time getting better. When she thought back to the cold look she gave Henry when he nicely asked for a table, her stomach hurt with guilt. The cook had left the kitchen to see what all the fuss was about. He now stood still with the spatula in his hand. The moment he saw Henry's face, he knew right away who it was. The cook remembered that he had agreed with Mr. Jack when he told him about turning away an inappropriate guest. He felt ashamed as he thought about it. When the main dish came out, Mrs. Stella stood up again and raised her glass to honor Dr. Henry Collins, a man who doesn't judge people by their looks and treats everyone with respect and kindness. We could all learn from what he did. The guests raised their glasses with a lot of enthusiasm. And Sam, to Dr. Collins. The staff was so moved by the moment that they couldn't help but lift their trays or whatever they were carrying and join the toast. Although the party was still going on, the eatery staff was getting more and more uncomfortable. Every story they heard about Dr. Henry Collins's kindness and skill seemed to make them even worse off than they were before. The weight of what they had done was heavy on their consciences. Mr. Jack stood stiffly by the kitchen door. He looked less confident than normal, and it was clear that he was upset. He saw Henry talk to the guests and noticed the doctor's friendly smile and calm demeanor, which were traits he had quickly brushed off the day before. Beth moved from table to table less gracefully than normal. As she refilled water glasses, her hands shook a little, and she avoided looking at the guests. She couldn't help but think of the cold look she gave Henry when he asked nicely for a table. The chef worked in silence in the kitchen. He had lost his excitement about cooking for a big event and felt a deep sense of shame. Instead, he remembered how quickly he had agreed with Mr. Jack that an unsuitable guest should be turned away, without giving any thought to the person behind the looks. As the night went on, the staff found themselves paying close attention to the stories being told. They heard about Henry's late-night visits to sick patients, his calming talks to scared kids before surgeries, and his unwavering promise to treat everyone with the same care and respect. As time went on, the huge difference between Henry's character and how they had been acting lately became clearer. The staff looked at each other and saw their own guilt in the other's eyes. They understood that what they were seeing wasn't just a dinner, but a strong lesson in being humble, treating everyone equally, and the harm of judging people by how they look. When Mr. Jack heard Mrs. Stella talk about how Henry had saved her life, he got a lump in his throat. He thought about how almost he had turned this interesting man away, because he didn't look like Mr. Jack thought a high-class restaurant customer should. As Beth was making the dessert, she stopped by the kitchen door to console herself with the thought of how badly their actions must have hurt Henry. She thought about how many other wonderful people they had missed and hurt over the years. All of a sudden, there was a loud, desperate gasp in the dining room, followed by the sound of silverware hitting the floor. Everyone looked to see what was making the noise. Tom, one of the waiters who had been in the group that wouldn't let Henry in the day before, was holding his throat. His face was a scary shade of red, and his eyes were wide with fear. He got a piece of food stuck in his throat while tasting some of the bar snacks in the kitchen. As the seriousness of the situation hit, the room went silent for a moment. Then chaos broke out. People got up, and chairs hit the floor. As they did so, there were warning calls from some people, and helpless looks from others who didn't know what to do. Mr. Jack stood still, his face showing shock and fear. Beth put her hands over her mouth, and eyes were wide with fear. The other employees huddled nearby, looking worried. But none of them seemed to know how to assist their coworker. As Henry looked at the waiter who was choking, he felt the comedy of the situation sink in. The staff, who had been so mean to him, now needed his help. He didn't hesitate, though. He had a strong desire to help someone who was in need. The whole room seemed to hold its breath as Henry stood up. The staff and guests stood still and watched as the doctor they had come to honor had to deal with an unexpected emergency. As soon as he saw Tom, Dr. Henry Collins jumped up from his seat and ran to his side. Everyone in the room went silent as they watched the drama play. The chaos around Henry was very different from his calm attitude. Tom was calmed down when Henry said in a soft voice, "I'm here to help. I am going to do the Heimlich maneuver. Try to stay calm." Henry moved smoothly behind Tom and wrapped his arms around the waiter's waist, putting one hand just above his navel and grabbing it with the other. Then Henry started to do belly thrusts with quick, strong movements. You could feel the stress in the room. When Mrs. Stella clenched her hands together, her palms turned white from worry. While he watched, Mr. Jack's face showed a mix of fear and shame. The other employees gathered together, putting aside their old biases, as they thought about how bad things were for their coworker. Henry kept making thrusts, and his face showed that he was focused. Tom's face was getting darker red, and his eyes were getting bigger with fear. It looked like the process wasn't working for a heart-stopping second. Then there was a loud gasp. The offensive piece of food flew out of Tom's mouth and made a small splat on the shiny floor. Tom took a long, rough breath in. As the air rushed back into his lungs, he coughed and sputtered. Henry gave Tom a gentle pat on the back to help him catch his breath. He said in a soft voice, "You're okay now. Just take slow, deep breaths." The room was eerily quiet as everyone watched in shock, letting the seriousness of what had happened sink in. Being out of breath, Tom turned to face Henry. Tears came to his eyes as he saw the man he had helped push away just yesterday. Thomas said in a low voice, "Thank you. You kept me alive." Henry gave Tom a friendly smile and put his hand on his shoulder to comfort him. He just said, "That's what I do. Do you feel better now?" Tom's nod broke the spell of quiet. The room erupted in cheers, with sighs of relief and murmurs of surprise, mixing with the sound of clapping hands. Mrs. Stella dabbed her eyes with a napkin, because she was so moved by seeing Henry's kindness for herself. Tom, the waiter, was still gasping for air as he looked at Henry with tears in his eyes. He looked like he was feeling a mix of relief, thanks, and overwhelming shame. The words wouldn't come out because his throat was still sore from what he had been through. Tom choked up his words, and his voice was barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard and wiggled a little because it hurt. "Dear Collins, I'm really sorry for how we had to treat you yesterday. That was wrong." Henry looked at Tom with warm brown eyes that were full of love and understanding. He put a soft hand on Tom's shoulder to help him stay steady. "It's okay," Henry said in a soft voice that was soothing. "You don't have to say sorry. I'm glad everything is okay with you." The tears were running easily down Tom's face as he shook his head. "That's not okay. We judged you even though we didn't know who you were. We were not right. Terrible. Now you've saved my life," she said. The room was quiet as everyone watched the moving exchange. The boss, Mr. Jack, stood nearby, his face showing that he felt bad about what he had done. That smile of Henry seemed to light up the room. It was kind and accepting. "It's important that you're safe now. So that's all I care about." Tom wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He still didn't understand why the doctor was being so kind. "Before what we did, how can you be so nice?" Henry took a big breath and looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who were watching. He spoke in a soft voice that could be heard clearly through the quiet restaurant. "We all do wrong," he said. "What counts is how we grow and learn from them. Since you said sorry, that process has already begun." Tom said yes, and a small smile broke through his tears. "Not only did you save my life, Dr. Collins, but you also taught me something." Henry gave Tom one last pat on the shoulder. "I'll never forget it." He smiled and said, "Thanks. Now, take a seat and drink some water. I know what you've been through." The rest of the staff stood still for a moment because they were still shocked by what had almost happened. After a while, they started to walk toward Henry, as if a spell had been broken. Their faces showed a mix of shock, shame, and thanks. Beth was the first person to come up to Henry. She was one of the hosts who had turned him away the day before. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her hands were shaking as she spoke. "Dr. Collins," she said, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to say how sorry I am. We can't explain how we treated you yesterday." Henry looked at her with kind eyes. He smiled softly, and the love that came from him seemed to calm everyone in the room. He said in a soft voice, "It's okay, Beth. We all do bad things. It's important that we learn from them." The other staff members came up one by one. The manager, Mr. Jack, then spoke up. He didn't have his normal air of superiority about him. Instead, he was genuinely sorry. "Dr. Collins," he started, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm truly sorry for what I did. My actions were not acceptable. I was so horribly wrong when I judged you by how you looked." Henry smiled and said, "Yes," graciously accepting the apology. "Thank you, Mr. Jack. Thank you for being honest." As each staff member spoke, Henry listened carefully, his face showing that he understood and could forgive. He didn't cut them off or act angry. Instead, he took each apology with the same respect and kindness he had shown throughout the whole thing. Jake, a young busboy, was the last person to come up. He looked up at Henry with respect in his eyes. "Dr. Collins, I want to be like you when I grow up," he said in a shaky voice. "Not just a doctor, but also someone who is willing to forget." "How do you do it?" This made Henry smile, because he knew the boy was being honest. He put a soft hand on Jake's shoulder. "It's not always easy," Henry said, "but I've learned that being angry just makes you worse. When you forgive someone, you can move on and make things better." Mrs. Stella was filled with pride as she watched the scene play out in front of her. When the staff truly apologized and Henry graciously forgave them, it was a moment of deep change. It was clear to her that she couldn't miss this chance. Mrs. Stella quickly cleared her throat and stepped forward, getting everyone's attention. As she started to speak, her eyes lit up with emotion. Without a doubt, she said, "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice clear and strong, "what we've seen here tonight is phenomenal." She stopped to let her words sink in. Everyone in the room was looking at her, and it was very quiet. This man was turned away from this restaurant yesterday. He saved the life of one of your own today without thinking twice. And now, he's here, forgiving you all with such kindness that it takes my breath away. Mrs. Stella's voice was a little shaky as she spoke. Dr. People should look up to Collins's commitment to helping others, no matter who they are or how they've treated him. He showed us that real power is not in how we judge others, but in how we treat them, especially after they've hurt us. She looked up at Henry with thankful eyes. To Henry, your kindness has no limits. With your kindness, you've shown us how to heal hearts and minds, as well as killing many people with your medical skills. Mrs. Stella's speech got stronger as she turned back to the staff and guests. Let us all learn from this. We should try to look past how people look and treat everyone with the respect and honor they deserve. We learned from Dr. Collins that it is possible to show love and understanding even when people are mean and prejudiced. The room went silent as Mrs. Stella's words hung in the air. Out of nowhere, a man in a clean suit walked forward from the back of the room. Mr. Franklin, who owns the business, was there. As he walked over to where Henry was standing, shame and sorrow were written all over his face. His voice was shaking, but Mr. Franklin cleared his throat. Dr. Collins, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for the way you were treated in my restaurant. Henry turned to face him and looked at him with a calm, interested look on his face. Everyone in the room held their breath, eager to see what would happen. Mr. Franklin's voice got louder as he said, "What happened to you was unacceptable." He stopped and took a deep breath before speaking to the whole room. As the owner, I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff. But more than that, I'm ashamed that such behavior could happen under my watch. Everyone here needs to know that this event has opened my eyes. It's clear that we have let down not only Dr. Collins, but also many other people who have come through our doors. His eyes were filled with truth as Mr. Franklin turned back to Henry. Dr. Collins, I promise you and everyone hear this. Starting today, we will give all of our employees full training on how to be welcoming and respectful to everyone. We will make sure that no one is ever treated badly in this business because of how they look or anything else. We will try to make a place where everyone feels welcome and valued. The restaurant owner said, his voice breaking with emotion. Dr. Collins, your kindness and forgiveness have shown us the way forward. There's a lot to do, but I promise we'll do better. There was a small smile on Henry's face as he nodded. The weight of the moment could be felt in the quiet room. The words of Mr. Franklin hung in the air like a promise of change and proof of how powerful Henry's kindness was. As Mr. Franklin said sorry from the bottom of his heart, Henry's eyes got softer. The room held its breath while they waited for him to answer. With a soft smile, Henry walked up to the diner owner and put out his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Franklin," Henry said, with a serious tone in his voice. "Thank you for saying sorry and promising to change. Being honest about our mistakes and taking steps to fix them takes a lot of guts." Mr. Franklin put his hand on Henry's and felt relieved. There was less tension in the room, and there was more hope and opportunity. In his next words, Henry was thoughtful and supportive. "I'd be happy to help run some of those training sessions if you want. As a doctor, I know how important it is to treat everyone with respect and honor, no matter what they look like or where they come from." Mr. Franklin's eyes got really big as he was shocked and thankful. "Dear Dr. Collins, that would be very kind of you. We'd love to hear what you have to say." Henry gave a nod and then stopped for a moment, as if he were thinking about something. His words were, "You know, there might be another way your restaurant could help our community." The owner leaned in to listen more. As Henry talked about his idea, his voice got more pumped up. "Have you ever thought about giving meals to people who work in hospitals or are in need? A lot of my coworkers work long hours and often skip meals. And a lot of people in our neighborhood have trouble putting food on the table." It made Mr. Franklin's face light up with joy. "That's a great thought, Dr. Collins. We could start a program to feed people who work in hospitals and shelters in the area. It would be a useful way for us to thank healthcare workers like you for all the hard work you do." "Thanks again." Henry smiled, clearly moved by how excited the owner was. He said in a soft voice, "I think that would really make a difference. You know, it's not just about the food. Getting people to know that they are seen and appreciated is important. When Henry told the owner about his plan, tears filled the owner's eyes. Mr. Franklin gave a strong nod, and his voice was heavy with feeling. "Yes, Dr. Collins, you're right. We'll start the program right away to give meals. We should at least try to help our neighborhood." The attentive staff at the restaurant started to nod their heads to show that they agreed. They looked at each other with faces that showed a mix of shame and respect. Someone from the wait staff stepped forward and put his hands together tightly in front of him. He said in a soft voice, "Dr. Collins, I'm so sorry for how we treated you. It's amazing how kind you are. There's a lot more you teach us than just how to run a business." Henry gave the servant a friendly smile and put his hand on his shoulder to make him feel better. He said in a soft voice, "We can all learn and grow. The important thing is that we want to do better." The staff agreed in a low voice, and their faces showed that they were more respectful and humble. They began to understand that this was more than just fixing a mistake. It was a deep lesson in respecting and caring for others. The scene was being watched by Mrs. Stella, who stepped forward. She proudly said, "I think we've all learned something today. Dr. Collins, you've shown us what forgiveness and grace really mean. When things went wrong, you turned them into a chance to learn and help others." As everyone thought about what she said, the room went quiet. The people on the staff looked at each other and then back at Henry. They looked like they were both amazed and determined. Not only did it make them want to change how they behaved at work, but it also made them want to become better people. Mr. Franklin cleared his throat, and his voice became steady as he spoke. "This is only the beginning, Dr. Collins, Mrs. Stella, and everyone else. We're going to turn this restaurant into a place that really helps and supports our village." There was a clear sense of change in the air as everyone nodded in agreement. At first, they were celebrating Henry's medical successes. But it turned into something much more, a lesson in kindness that none of them would soon forget. People began to leave the restaurant as the night came to a close. Each of them went to Henry before they left, though, eager to say thank you one last time. It was amazing how the mood in the room had changed. What had started out as a night of guilt and shame had turned into a beautiful evening, filled with hope and unity that touched everyone there. The first person to talk to Henry was Mrs. Moore. Her eyes were filled with tears as she held his hands in hers. "Dr. Collins, thank you so much. Because you saved my life and showed us all what kindness really looks like." With a friendly smile, Henry spoke in a soft, humble voice. "Dear Mrs. Moore, your thanks mean a lot to me. Remember, though, that each of us can make a difference in our own way." The other guests came forward one by one. There was a young guy whose life Henry had saved in a car accident and an old woman who had just gone through a dangerous heart surgery. Each person had a story to tell or a time to share of being thankful. As they watched in silence, the restaurant staff was deeply moved by these exchanges. The fact that they saw Henry change so many lives made them even more determined to make a difference. The waiter who had choked earlier in the evening came up to Henry again as the last of the guests said goodbye. His eyes had red edges, but his speech was steady. "Dr. Collins, I'm not sure how to thank you. Even though we were mean to you, you saved my life tonight. This lesson will stay with me forever." There was a light touch on the waiter's shoulder from Henry. Life gives us second chances every once in a while. The important thing is what we do with them. The owner of the restaurant, Mr. Franklin, stood nearby and watched these conversations with a mix of shock and determination. He understood that his business had been given a rare chance, a chance to rethink its goals and values. A calm feeling came over the room when the last guest left. The anxiety that had been there at the start of the evening had gone away, and in its place was a sense of understanding and shared purpose. It felt like everyone there had been a part of something truly unique, a moment of change that would stay with them long after the night was over. He took a deep breath as he left the restaurant and into the cool night air. He had no idea how emotional the evening would be. It was like a tornado of feelings. He stopped on the path for a moment to think about what had happened that night. The doctor thought about the time he was turned away from this very same business the day before. At that time, he remembered how hurt and disappointed he had been. But now, as he stood there, those feelings had been replaced by hope, which was much stronger. When Henry thought about how the night had gone, he couldn't help but smile. What began as a simple dinner to honor him had grown into something much bigger. It was now a time of change, a time for growth and learning. He was extremely thankful, not only for the praise he had gotten, but also for the chance to really make a difference. Henry felt like he had a purpose because of how the staff had opened their eyes and hearts, and how the boss had promised to make changes. On his way home, Henry thought about how one act of kindness could affect many people in ways he could never have imagined. He had always believed that kindness could make a difference, but tonight he saw how far it could reach. The events of the day weighed on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reflection of how responsible he was. Henry knew that his job wasn't just to save lives in the operating room. It was also to bring about change, break down obstacles, and show people the best of what people can be. Henry felt like he had a new purpose as he walked. Even though he was thankful for the praise, what he really appreciated most was the chance to help make the world a better place. It had shown him tonight that there was always hope for change, even when there was bias and confusion. The business went through a huge change in the weeks after that night. That changed everything. As promised by the owner, the business started to use new rules and procedures that showed a dedication to welcoming everyone and helping the community. The first change that could be seen was a new sign that was put up near the door. In beautiful writing, it said, "All are welcome here." This simple message helped both staff and customers remember the restaurant's new ideals all the time. The mood inside had also changed. The staff used to be rude and judgmental, but now they treated every customer with true kindness and respect. They had gone through a lot of training on customer service and being open to everyone. They learned to see past people's looks and treat everyone with respect. But the restaurant's new marketing program was the most important change. Every Tuesday and Thursday, there was extra action in the kitchen, as chefs made meals for hospital staff and people in need, as well as paying customers. On these days, you could see a line of doctors, nurses, and other medical workers going down the block. They were met with smiles and thanks for all the hard work they had done. The food was served in hot containers. The restaurant didn't stop there. They also worked with local shelters and community groups to feed people who were in need. Once every 2 weeks, workers would come to help pack up food and give it to people who needed it the most. These days, Dr. Henry Collins often stopped by, but not as a guest of honor. He did it as a favor. He would put on an apron and work with the other people there, serving food and talking to the people who came. His appearance was a strong reminder of what had happened to cause this change. The neighborhood was affected by these projects in many ways. Other companies in the area were inspired by the restaurant to start their own community outreach programs and policies that were open to everyone. Today, the diner was more than just a place to eat. It was a symbol of hope and unity in the city. Over the course of several weeks and months, Dr. Henry Collins kept working hard at the hospital. His days were full of surgeries, seeing patients, and teaching other doctors how to do their jobs. But now, he had a new spring in his step, and a sense of purpose that went beyond his medical tasks. EJ stopped by the window of the children's ward one sunny afternoon as he made his rounds. Children who were sick at the hospital got on a bus with a lot of energy. They were going to the restaurant that had turned him away before, but had now become a place where everyone felt welcome. Henry smiled when he saw it. He remembers the day the owner of the restaurant had asked him if they could hold monthly lunches for the kids who were in the hospital. Henry agreed right away because he saw it as another way to help their town heal and come together. Over the course of his rounds, Henry thought about the events that had led to this point. That night at the restaurant, the sadness and shame he felt at first seemed like a long time ago. Instead, there was a deep appreciation for how things had turned out in a way that no one had expected. He thought about Mrs. Stella Moore and how her kind deed had started everything. What could have been a very angry moment for her, she turned into a chance to learn and grow. He reminded himself to thank her again when she came in for her next checkup. As Henry was getting ready to leave the hospital that cold night, a young nurse with tears in her eyes stopped him. She thanked him for making the community better by telling him about how the restaurant's new outreach program had helped her grandmother, who was having a hard time making ends meet. Henry heard and was moved deeply by what she said. As he drove home that night, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest. It was a deep sense of satisfaction and the knowledge that what he had done in and out of the operating room had caused far more positive effects than he could have thought. Let me know in the comments section what interests you the most in this story. It takes me lots of time to put this story together for you. Kindly leave a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and share this video. Also, check out our channel for more stories like this. Let's meet over there.